Welcome to the Uniting America podcast, presented to you by Braver Angels. I'm Braver Angels National Ambassador and your host, JohnWoodJr. This is your doorway into the movement to save the Republic, the movement to realize the dream of Martin Luther King. Join us. This is the movement to build a house united. April Lawson is a singular figure in Braver Angels and in the larger civic renewal movement. A Braver Angels director, managing director of debates and discourse. It is April Lawson who has built up the largest and most impactful program the Braver Angels offers, our Braver Angels debates program, popular on college campuses throughout America, but also in local communities. This contribution to our work has made it possible for us to leverage conflict in a way that brings people together in a deeper and more intense way. And the very fact that you can do that in the work of creating understanding and trust between people is itself something that April has contributed as an intellectual in this space in a way that's totally unique to her. Nobody else has really seized upon the idea that through our conflicts, we become stronger together in this work, except for April. And yet for all of that, most people who follow the work of Braver Angels from outside of our community do not realize what a pivotal figure she has been to our organization, to our community, and to the larger movement that we are building together. So in today's episode of Uniting America, I wanted to shine a light on April's work, on her work in the context of Braver Angels, her thoughts on conservatism, feminism, her larger social and political worldview, because as we build this movement together, it is clear to me that her leadership at Braver Angels and beyond is going to be a part of whatever transformation our labors together might inspire in the United States of America. And so now I bring you my colleague and friend, April Lawson. April Lawson, welcome to Uniting America.
Thanks so much, John. It's great to be here.
It is.
It is, actually.
Yeah, right? Welcome to the studio. Welcome to our humble podcast abode.
Yes,
right?
Yes. No, it's not so humble in my view.
Well,
but
you got the grand tour. You got to see where the magic happens.
Yes.
Very
here, magical.
Yes, indeed. And so here we are, close colleagues and friends who have recorded many a podcast together, but never in person.
Yeah. Yes. Somehow.
And so, now, we've played host to some extraordinary guests on Uniting America. And, we've had folks from Sam Harris, Kim Iverson, and Tavis Smiley, and, there are going to be many others. But, in terms of like scheduling difficulties, I'd say you are at the top of the list.
No. I believe you.
People have a hard time getting a hold of sometimes for a thing like this.
Public shaming. Is that what this podcast interview is going to be about?
That's how we unite America.
Absolutely. Yes. We can all feel shame.
There you go.
Yay.
I mean, that is the approach that some would take, I think.
Yes, indeed.
And that actually might be relevant to a little bit of what we talk about here, right? Mm-hmm. So folks will have heard in my pre-recorded sort of introduction, more of an in-depth kind of overview of, some of your some aspects of your resume and so forth. But I do want to give you the opportunity to say a bit about sort of, kind of your professional background, how you come into this work, and just as an additional sort of layer of context. The reason this episode is so important is because this podcast, this show, it exists to give some small additional sort of voice and megaphone to a movement that is rising in America that really seeks to fundamentally sort of transform the way in which we fail, of course, to recognize the deep human dignity that lives in the heart of our fellow Americans across the spectrum of politics and identity, right? And within that, to shine a light on people who are leading this movement from across that very same spectrum. And so within the movement, broadly speaking, but within the work of Braver Angels in particular, there has been, I think it's fair to say, no more original or impactful both voice, thinker, and in addition to that, methodological innovator, if you will, when it comes to creating containers, right, for discourses rooted in deep empathy, but also deep honesty, right? We'll get to some of that. Then April Lawson, then yourself. And so, I want to say that to set the stage. We're going to get into your work within Braver Angels, the particular perspectives you bring to this movement. But first, tell us a little bit just on the high end about who you were professionally sort of prior to the work of Braver Angels that led you up to the point and place where you are now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for those words.
You're welcome.
And I hope I can live up to them. So professionally, so I graduated from Yale in 2019.
Okay.
I had studied anthropology and I had fallen in love with political philosophy. And there's more to that story, but leaving that aside for the moment, I moved to Washington, D.C. because I thought that that's where you do political philosophy. And it turns out that that's like kind of true, but also kind of not. Mostly there's a lot of political and not as much philosophy in my experience, but there was one, so I started looking around for somebody to work for. And there was one, and I was looking for someone, I assumed it would be some senator or some political appointee, someone who inspired me. And I found that there was only one voice who I really was like, oh, that person is speaking for the things that I care about. And that was David Brooks of the New York Times.
Right.
So I went to a lunch that he was at, and I got him to give me his email address. And I emailed him and he didn't write back.
Sure.
And so then I went back the next year and went to the lunch again. And this time I gave him a letter and I emailed him some more and he didn't write back. And in the meantime, this will come back in a few minutes.
Okay.
But in the meantime, I have always been interested in translating between cultures and in helping people encounter one another really deeply, both across and through their cultures. And so I looked for jobs that had something to do with that. And so I actually first went back to New Haven, Connecticut, worked for the mayor there. It was actually one of my favorite jobs. My job was to get the people in that city who were unlikely to participate in the census, which is, of course, the source of a lot of federal funding, to do so. So I had to figure out who was trusted in the African American community, in the Latino community, in the undocumented Irish immigrant community. Unexpected, but that's a thing in New Haven.
Right.
Anyway, so I did that. And then I unexpectedly got an opportunity to work in the Treasury Department for the guy who was then the number 2 person there. And from there, I shifted to political campaign. And then that ended with the election. And then so several things in quick succession. And then I, again, the through line here is cultural translation. I went to the intelligence community for a couple of years. And then after that, I took a couple months off, spent some time in China. I was, what I felt like I needed to realize is that Yale and DC have sort of a similar underlying moral logic, which is rise, become a leader in whatever most of the rest doesn't matter, just rise wherever you are.
Ambition is core to the ethos.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Please.
I guess that won't surprise anyone.
No. And so I realized that that's actually those are not my values. I'm not sure I've ever said this in public before. He'll probably get mad at me, but that made me go back to David Brooks and be like, oh, I just want to do something small and humble. And
meanwhile, work for David Brooks at the New York Times.
I mean,
that doesn't sound too small and humble though for a lot of people.
Exactly. It's funny because I was just going to go be his assistant, and I thought that was I was leading a team and I was going to go back to that. But
I take it this is because he didn't answer your emails and therefore you needed to become the person who answered emails for him.
Basically, right? Yes. Okay. Yes, that's more or less it. No, I mean, I at one point sent him literally 8 emails, like one a week for 8 weeks, saying I'd really love to talk to you. And to my shock, he wrote back to me, and then I got to know his assistant, and then she blah blah blah. My joke is that I stalked him, but eventually he gave me a job. And that was really an important job for me, because it told me that there is a place for complex and nuanced thought and for being who you actually are in American life. Plus, he's just a deeply good person who I learned a lot from.
Indeed.
And then I co-founded the Weave the Social Fabric project, which is with David, the program we ran at the Aspen Institute. And then I, after that, started working for Braver Angels, and I can say more about that. But
yes.
yeah.
So we will get into your Braver Angels story, of course, and there's a lot to unearth in that conversation. Prior to getting to that part of our focus here today, I do want to sort of go into some of the deeper parts of your experiential biography here. So many of us come to the work of civic bridge building, this goodwill, unity, bridging movement that is coalescing people again from across the spectrum of identities and points of view in American society. So many of us come to this movement with a story. Sometimes it's a story that might be like a revelation, some flash of controversy wakes some of us up to the idea that our inability to treat each other as human beings in politics have consequences. I think others of us come to this work after having experienced perhaps long arcs in which our relationships have been impacted by our differences in perspective and experience, perhaps as a result of some of our own views changing over time, which is what happens with human beings who live and grow so much, right? Um, so so tell us about sort of where you come from originally, and weave that in, if it's easy enough for you to do so, sort of into the path that ultimately led you to the passion that drives you now.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that's a big question.
It is. I specialize in those.
Yes, you do. That's a true statement. I grew up in Kansas,
Yeah.
and because I'm a conservative now, most people assume that, oh yeah, just one of those people who grew up conservative stayed that way, no big deal.
Sure.
That's actually not my story. I started off, so my parents are brilliant, now retired economics professors who are also deeply liberal. I actually think the better word is leftist, although I don't know if they would identify that way or whatever
Sure.
the term is these days. But they shaped me deeply with a sense that that it's important to ask questions, and also we didn't fit where we were, because we were in a pretty evangelical part of Kansas, and we were the only non-religious people that we knew, and in a place where the first question is often, "Oh, it's great to meet you. Where do you go to church?"
Right.
It just didn't work super well for us. And so I got very used to being in one moral and political climate inside the house, and then walking out and having to speak a completely different language outside the house.
Sure.
And I then a funny thing happened, which is that I went to Yale, like I said, and I did debate in high school, and that was like a really great thing for me because again, it was a place where people could play with ideas. So I went to find the debating groups at Yale, and there was something called the Yale Political Union, which is this group that is a debating society that has several different sort of sub societies in it that have different political slants, ideological identities.
Right.
And I was looking for the Liberal Party, and Yale has a residential college called Branford that has a common room, but it also has something called the Branford Trumbull Room. And I got these mixed up. And so
Okay.
I wandered in to the Tory Party, which had everybody was in bow ties and they were drinking port, but I didn't really know that that wasn't just how liberals at Yale did things.
Okay.
And so I stayed for a minute, and I heard this speech on the floor of the Tory Party that was about patriotism, and it was about living for things that are beyond you and that are worth more than life itself. And I was just transfixed. And then I stayed for a little longer, and I heard a very different speech about sacrificial love from a man I later came to deeply respect as just one of the most thoughtful and good Christians I'd ever met. And he spoke to the same, living for things that are beyond you. And I felt like I had found people who spoke the language that my heart spoke, but I didn't know that they existed. I didn't know anybody else like thought that way, believed that way. So I then began reading all kinds of, Edmund Burke and G.K. Chesterton and Russell Kirk and all these people. And lo and behold, I was a conservative, and I had to go home and tell my parents that.
And just to be clear, sort of
Yeah.
a conservative of, I guess, a somewhat different flavor, because
Right.
certainly, so what you've discovered at Yale, by the way, it's interesting. You explained the process by which you sort of discovered your political identity at Yale. You know, at Hogwarts, they just have a sorting hat. Where you put
That
it
would be
on.
so much simpler, right?
Right, yeah. It wouldn't be nice if you put the hat on and it can say Tory, as opposed to Gryffindor or
Yes.
whatnot.
Yes.
So, you have this particular pathway, and this conservatism that you discovered, it's not the liberalism or leftism of your parents, but it's not quite the evangelical conservatism
Exactly.
of your upbringing, too.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, maybe as we go in the conversation, we can talk a little bit about the differences.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the salient point here is that you experienced this conversion, essentially, in your politics and worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Then you had to tell your parents about it. Is that where we're going? Okay.
That's where we're going.
Okay.
And I'm not going to go into it a lot.
Sure.
But that didn't go very well. And the stereotype is that the parents are conservative and the kid becomes liberal, but it turns out that it doesn't go real well the other way either. And
I sent my liberal daughter to college and she came back
to
conservative,
Yale, like to the East Coast, out of the middle of nowhere.
Right.
And yes,
you are flipping the stereotype. Of the story a little bit.
It's an accident, but yes.
There you go.
But yeah, that didn't go super well, and we kept the thing that I will say that is a deep thing I believe in is that we kept trying to communicate, but I would say it took 10 years maybe for us to be kind of okay with that, with each other, given all that. Right. And there was a religious conversion as part of this too, and there was just I am really familiar with the fact that this can divide families, and not not in a little way, in like a am I still your daughter kind of way. And so I've been really clear the whole time that people on both sides of this divide, right, have good hearts, because when you're whether you're a liberal in Kansas or a conservative at Yale, you just know that there are real people behind that. And I also would say that I came to have little patience with shallow. See, you said a lot of people come into this bridging space thinking that they want to bring everybody together and make everybody see how much the same they are.
Sure.
And I that is actually part of why I thought I would never ever work in the bridging space, which sounds funny, but I actually think that I guess I would say that I have seen too much reconciliation, false reconciliation that essentially sweeps things under the rug. And I think that is one of the worst things you can do when there's real division and real pain and real difference. Right. And that I will never believe in that. What I believe in instead is truth and reconciliation is the phrase that comes to mind for me, but I actually mean both of those words. So the word, that phrase tends to be used in a particular context, but I think that you have got to have truth if you're going to have real reconciliation, but that most forces in society seem oriented towards either telling the truth and burn it all down, doesn't matter what happens after that, or else they're interested in reconciliation, but if a little truth has to go under the rug, oh well.
Right.
But I can't tolerate that. And so I came to respect Braver Angels partly because they don't do that.
So perhaps moving into your Braver Angels story will also open up the opportunities for us to get into this sort of particular, I think, philosophical contributions that you've made to the thinking of the space, because you're already sort of hinting at it, sort of a unique sort of understanding of the nature of truth and reconciliation, what that ought to look like, and also sort of the dangers of genericizing our differences so as to emphasize our commonalities, right? And so let's make our way to those points. But let's begin by picking up the story at, I suppose, at the point at which you find yourself um, becoming familiar with and then ultimately engaging Braver Angels. Where does that begin?
Totally. So after the 2016 election, David Brooks and I were, I think, both a little demoralized and chagrined,
Right.
because as the conservatives at the times with Ross Douthat, we were supposed to. It was just, I'll only speak for myself here because I don't want to speak for them, but I was a little bit mortified to discover that I and we were so out of touch that we could have missed this. And I also, frankly, was just mortified that my brothers and sisters in America would uh, elect someone with that kind of character. I'm a never Trump Republican, as you can tell,
Right.
but the so I then and we started looking for like who's working on this problem. There's a cultural rift here that is profound, and it's not something that will go away on its own. It has the serious chance of tearing apart everything else with it. And so started looking for organizations working on that, and I ran into David Blankenhorn, friend of a friend, introduced us.
David Blankenhorn, of course, being president of
president of at that time a concept, not something that existed, but yes.
And he had been, of course, the president of the Institute for American Values,
right,
which is a think tank dedicated to the study of family and fatherhood and things along these lines. And so,
yeah. And so I didn't really know much about him, but I liked what he said. And so I heard that Braver Angels was doing a bus tour, and they were going to go around the country doing these workshops, summer of 2017. And so I said, I went back to David Brooks and was like, can I cover that? And he said, sure. And so I went.
And of course, we weren't Braver Angels at the time.
Right. Better Angels. Excuse me. Yeah. Right. So I got on that bus with my, my little notepad, and I interviewed people at all the workshops, and listened to the staff trying to think out, like, how do we handle this? Where do we go next? That sort of thing. But something important happened, which is that at the end of those workshops, there was something in people's faces that I really, the best word I have for it is joy. I know that's an unexpected word. People usually expect the word hope, and that word was there too. But I think it was joy at discovering that the people that they had thought they had lost, or were their enemies now that they didn't know anymore, were actually still their neighbors and their brothers and their sisters and their friends. And that, I was like, that something there, I want to be part of that. And so I was just totally compelled. And I, took off my journalist hat and kept bothering David Blankenhorn and eventually joined the board. And then in 2018 was at a meeting where David was saying, Blankenhorn, now not Brooks, was saying, I think that we need better ways to reach Reds, our parlance for conservatives, of course, and youth, college students. What if we were to try some form of debate? And I said, oh my gosh, like, I know about that. Like, maybe this is something I can help with.
Right, because this takes us back to your experience at Yale.
Exactly, yeah. So I debated in high school and then in the Yale Political Union. And in the political union, I learned the form of debate that I have based Braver Angels debate on, which the most important thing about it is that you say what you actually believe, and people actually listen. And you don't shrink from conflict, but you do. You follow parliamentary procedure, and it's very fair. And you answer questions, and anyone in the room can speak. And it's at once egalitarian and liberating for people to speak, but also brave. Like, you don't you go ahead and say the things in an orderly but like authentic fashion.
Right.
And so I said, hey David, D blank, as I call him, in retaliation for him calling David Lap D-Lap.
We suffer from an excess of Davids in our work in general.
They are everywhere. You should. Oh my gosh, my life. I've worked for 2 David B's, so I can't even. I can't even just.
You can't even do that.
No.
Yeah.
It's a problem. Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, I said, hey, I think I know something that could help here. And he said, oh, okay. And then a couple months later, he called me and said, we're going to East Tennessee State. And I
Mm.
said, what? And he said, we're going to East Tennessee State. We're going to run a debate there. There are two young men there, freshmen, I think, who have started a civic week, and I
Mhm.
want you to run a debate for them. And so I was like, okay. And it was the first time I'd ever taught debate, and but it just went so well, and it was so clear from that moment that like it was a guns debate, shortly 3 weeks after the Parkland shooting,
Mm.
and it was East Tennessee. So,
Right.
and the topic was, should students be allowed to carry guns on campus? So very personal, um, and it was just very powerful because people said all kinds of like um, things that related to their own lives. I don't feel safe on campus because if there were an incident, the police would take 5 minutes to get here and that would be it. I need to be armed. Professor saying I'm scared to, if I give a kid a bad grade, what if he's carrying?
Right.
And then our next debate was at American University. I think it was our next one on healthcare, and it was similarly powerful.
Mm.
It The resolution there was um, resolved healthcare as a human right. And I will never forget the young woman who stood up and said, healthcare is not just a right for people who can afford it.
Mm.
And she said afterwards that she was in no way planning on speaking. This is one of the things, I'm sorry, I could go on about
No,
this,
please do, please
but
do. Yeah.
about Brave Angels debate is
Mhm.
that I love watching people who come into the room sure that they're not going to speak. They think they're just going to, sit back and listen and
Right.
chill.
Sure.
Um, and then you watch them and something begins to bubble up in them. And suddenly there's something they really need to say.
Mm.
And so they raise their hands and they stand up. And then, like this woman, it was so powerful because she told a story of how she herself would not be here today were it not for health insurance.
Mm.
And there were tears, and the whole room was just, you could hear a pin drop.
Mm.
Um, and then what was amazing was the next person who came up and gave a speech also told a personal story. He said, I have a hearing loss. And if it were 100 years ago, everybody would know because I'd need to wear a giant hearing aid.
Right.
But because of the free market, again, he was opposed to
Mm.
um, government provided healthcare.
Right.
Uh, he said, everybody thinks this doesn't have to define my life because I
Mm.
have a little tiny hearing aid nobody knows about.
Mm.
And then there are kids who like, my favorite, one of my favorites, the first young man who got up and said he was going to speech, I think said he was like sweating buckets and like,
Sure.
they're fun, but you see them blossom and you
Mm.
see them uh, show up in a way
Right.
that you never would before, or never that they often never have before,
Right.
in front of their peers.
Yeah. Well, I can certainly personally testify to the power of the model that you've innovated, and that has become, I think really our most popular program offering, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, it's certainly on college campuses, the thing that we've sort of led with, but
Hmm.
and dozens and dozens of campuses across America, to say nothing of all of the local communities in
Hmm.
which this program is deployed. And so, of course, Professor Bill Doherty, Braver Angels co-founder, is the architect of our original family therapy-based workshops, a wide suite of activities aimed at cultivating empathy and relational and communicative techniques. But your unique contribution through the Braver Angels debate program has been something that has sort of taken the work of depolarization in a direction that I'm not sure any other organization or entity had ever thought to do so, in part because this idea of leveraging conflict as a means
Hmm.
of relationship building, it would almost seem antithetical to what people think that sort of civic bridge building work
Exactly.
is
Hmm.
supposed to be about. So can you just say something briefly about why some of what you've said already sort of anticipates this, but what made you think that was a good idea?
Yes. No, it is
Right.
so counterintuitive. I cannot tell you how many times I say, "Oh, I work to bridge divides," and people say, "Oh, how do you do that?" Debate. What?
Right.
Debate tears us apart. What are you talking about?
Mhm.
But the thing is that conflict is not optional.
Yeah.
Because we have so much difference, and because we have very good reasons to disagree about things,
Mhm.
and we have different experiences, different value systems, different. I mean, there's all kinds of difference, and I think that I hope my blue colleagues will forgive me. if I say that it sometimes is a blue assumption to say that, well, we just need to recognize that we're all humans, we're all people, and we can just sit in a circle. I don't mean to caricature. I actually think that helping people see that we're all, in some deep ways, the same is very important part of this work.
Although a lot of social justice leaning or interested progressives might be very quick to go the other direction.
Right. Which is actually interesting too, because I have a real heart for very passionate people.
Right.
So I like activists a lot.
Yeah.
Even though we don't necessarily.
Sure, we can circle back on the question of activist culture, because I know that you have a fair amount to say about social justice, and maybe we can have some space for it.
Maybe.
But in any event, so you find yourself, of course, making this counterintuitive case.
Right, and so conflict is not avoidable. Right. The only thing we get to decide is how are we going to deal with it? Are we going to navigate it well, or are we going to sort of try to avoid it and then bumble our way through it? And I also just think that a thing that I learned in my family and at Yale, but really in my family first, is that it is possible to have conflict in a way that builds relationship. People think of conflict as something that is destructive, but it does not have to be. It can be a deep form of encounter where you really see another person and where this is going to sound funny, but it feels like something of their spirit gets added to yours because you actually hear them, and you hear something that is really other and really different. And it makes you deeper, wiser, and it very much can create intimacy. And, people in every relationship has some of this, right? You don't love the people that you love because they're the same as you. You love them for the exact particular thing that they are, which sometimes, so like one of the examples I often use is my mother, who, again, I'm a Burkean conservative. She's a economic justice person. Right. And one of the things that I love most about her is she will never forget about working people, about people who are spending every day working 2 jobs, trying to make ends meet, trying to put their kids through schooling. And it's very easy for people in elite worlds to just be like, oh yeah, the working class, yeah, they're a political commodity. But she will never forget who they are and how hard they work. And I love that about her. And it's a thing that I could do with more of. And so I think it's very possible to engage conflict in a way that makes you love people.
Right.
And I guess the final thing I'd say on the subject is that, again, this is a little intense, but I don't think bridging efforts will ever get anywhere if we don't do some of this, because too many people are too alienated, and they can smell it if you're just trying to get them to agree with people or to say, oh yeah, we're all the same. There's too much pain often, and too much anger, too much alienation for people to want to be part of something like that. And I'll be honest, I have felt this at times too. And so I think that's why truth has to come before reconciliation, and you've got to go through the conflict first.
Indeed. Well, I see, though you were making a point about differences, I do see plenty of your mother in you, insofar as...
Thank you.
Well, indeed. And in particular here, the fact that you were never content, in my observation of you, to allow people who should be brought within the familial circle of or civic understanding to remain alienated from that project. And that's very clearly manifest in the work that you've done in Braver Angels, but also the voice that you've been and the presence that you have held in Braver Angels. And that takes me to our experience with the 2020 election. The period of time leading up to it, the election itself, but then, of course, the conflict and the controversy surrounding the claims of voter fraud that were made, ultimately culminating in January 6th, a moment that really was precisely the thing that we were working so hard at Braver Angels, to avoid. I mean, believing and having seen, there's the summer of 2020, and of course, the aftermath of George Floyd, so many things, and then to have, I call it the long year of 2020 because it clearly lasted at least a week,
It sure did.
past the end, past the end of that calendar year. But to have it culminate in January 6th in a moment where so many Americans thought to themselves that I am done with these people on the other side,
Yes.
right? And yet I feel that our ability to maintain the family of our larger community at Braver Angels rested so much on the graceful example that you yourself sort of set forth in some of the key programs and events that we held after that, and many other ways as well. So I'm wondering if you can take us back a little bit to 2020, the aftermath of January 6th. Just recount for us a little bit, or maybe we can recount together sort of, what the journey was, what your particular experience was, and what were some of the key things that we did that allowed us to, if not hold all of America together, at least hold our piece of America together within the community of Braver Angels.
It's a really good question. It was a frightening year.
Yeah.
It was a year when it was hard to spend any time not working because it was so clear
Yeah.
that it wasn't real clear. It was so clear that there was no certainty that we were all going to make it through this. And we have, at least in some fashion. But I remember leading up to the 2020 election, wondering if we should train nonviolent protesters to break up riots in the streets, like literally trying to figure out like how do we serve our country here. And I think that the one of the ways that we found to serve was by creating spaces for people to first in the night after the election, the night of the election and the night after actually, to just sit with where we were, and not try to make it all make sense, not try to make everybody feel the same way, but just be able to be together.
Right.
Because there's a way in which that's actually the act, the essential nature of it is just, can you be together?
Yeah.
And so right after the election, it was that. And then, oh my goodness.
In moments
January
like that,
6th,
it's a tall order.
It is a tall order. It is a tall order. And it's a tall order for the participants. Like, we do what we can to create that space. And I'm happy to speak to that, but it's a tall order for the people who show up to be able to say, I'm going to sit in this room with it.
And one little bit of the history that I'll sort of fill in here too was that we created these spaces for people to come together virtually on election night, and part of something we were talking about this earlier, but part of what we did was we sort of had these Zoom spaces where we had sort of events where people could commune with each other for short periods of time, led by people of different religious traditions and some none of no particular religious tradition, where people were able to sort of come into these shared spaces and really kind of tap into even their spiritual resources as a means of reestablishing this connection, this bond that we have as brothers and sisters in America that ought to transcend our political differences, but that is very difficult to sustain without that kind of framework of grace and humility, if you will, which, I think we try to cultivate at Braver Angels. And following that, we had a couple of programs that sort of ran simultaneously. One was called With Malice Towards None, and it was sort of on the ground in physical community programs held by ministries and community level organizations, civic groups that basically were just bringing people together to do the simple thing that you mentioned, just, proving that we can share space together, in the aftermath of that particularly bitter election. There was more to it than that, but, it's rooted in just that goal. And then we had something called Hold America Together, which really was an attempt to sort of begin to move towards what you just identified was, this incredibly sort of, ambitious thing to say, okay, do we have a response to physical violence? If things start to erupt in violence in American streets, can we bring people together? Can we deploy people in local communities, Braver Angels members and volunteers, who can come together to try and hold peaceful space in the midst of political violence? And we were prepared to sort of move on that, and weeks passed, the controversies mounted, but it seemed that coming all the way up to the day of the inauguration, that maybe we had escaped what we thought was the real likelihood of violence in the streets in America. And then January 6th came to pass. So what happened to us then?
Oh my goodness. A shock to the system in America. And we knew that we had to, again, just provide a space.
Right.
And the question was then, what is done with that space? Who speaks? What do they say?
Right.
And for some reason, I was given the task of leading that, moderating that space, and in particular with.
And this was a virtual.
It was a virtual yeah.
event.
It's actually our most well-attended event ever. I think we had 7,000 people sign up, and
we'll include a link to
Great.
that for people who want to watch the whole
yeah,
video.
yeah, awesome.
Mhm.
And it was. I have had very few periods as stressful as the 48 hours before that, because I realized that somehow I needed to figure out how to create a space that people who felt that those protesters had come close to achieving their goal, but unfortunately had been snatched away from them, and people who thought that our country was on the verge of collapse and those people ought to be disowned.
Yeah.
And people who, some friends of mine who are people of color who saw the violent overtones in that as being relevant to their own personal safety and all the rest of that. And so I think the footage itself is probably the best expression of it, but what I remember is just needing to give all those people a place in the room. And so what I did was literally to the way to set the scene was literally to not name as in use their names, but name people in the room. Say, there's a person here who was at the protests a couple nights ago who still has bruises. There's a person here who is so angry that he doesn't really want me to tell you that he feels afraid for his own safety. Person of color. There's a person here who feels like he's been or she's been personally violated in a sacred area, that being the Capitol building. There's a person here who doesn't understand how the party of conservatism has left them. Like they're just all these people in the room, and it's there's a way in which the thing that we need to do is create a very large space that's very quiet, so that everybody can settle in and be there. And then you can begin to go in, right? And to say, what was this about for you? What did this mean for you? And how do we live with each other, given that this has happened?
Right.
So I can say more about that, but I would mention also that this conflict didn't actually start there. There was one of the debates that I have found most powerful. There's one before all this and one after it. And the one before was, it's 2020, right? One of the debates that I have found most powerful in my time leading this work was shortly after George Floyd's murder. And it was, I don't remember the exact topic. It was something like America is an inherently racist nation or something. Right. And I just remember, or maybe it was about the police, because I remember a social worker saying, I don't want to be sent in to this. And I remember
Perhaps we marketed that as a debate over defunding.
That's right. Defund the police. That's what it was.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. Good memory.
Right.
Yeah. And I just remember the intensity that came out on all sides of that, both sides, but really all the sides. Yeah. And
Derek Steele of the Social Justice Learning Institute was involved in that. Joy, I'm trying to think. It's been a while, but
Melina was too.
Melina Lawrence, that's right, from Deep Rooted Entertainment here in Los Angeles. A number of remarkable people.
Yeah. And I just remember at the end of it. So we have a debrief process at the end of our debates, which is important because debates are inherently divisive, and you need to give people a chance to come back together in a way at the end of it. And so there's always a debrief where we ask people to speak to what did you learn and what did you enjoy. And I just remember this woman who was speaking. She was off camera, and it was because she was pretty choked up, and she just said, "This is really hard.
Right.
It's really good, but it's really hard."
Mhm.
And I just that was before the election. That was before
Mhm.
January 6th.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So just giving people a chance to like say what they needed to.
Mm.
But then on the other side, so I think the most controversial event Braver Angels has ever run
Mhm.
was our debate that was early March of that year of 2021 after January 6th
Right.
that
Mhm.
was on voter fraud. It
Mhm.
was essentially debating whether the election was stolen.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you probably remember it because
I I remember it. I remember it
yes.
very, very well. And, I had a bit
Yeah.
of a role myself in the internal conversations
Yes.
over this. I mean, I think that one of the things that I remember talking to David Blankenhorn about early in that year was just the fact that, Braver Angels, regardless of what my opinion or your opinion or David or anybody else's opinion might be with respect to the merit or lack thereof of the voter fraud claim, polls at the time indicated that 70% or so of Republicans felt that the election either was or very likely may have been stolen by
Mhm.
fraud, and that, if we were going to keep our integrity as an
Ah.
organization, committed to bringing
Mhm.
everyone to the table for the purposes of a larger reconciliation, we had to talk about the things that people cared about. That
Mhm.
certainly included that issue. And yet,
Mhm.
there are so many people in America at the time, and I think even still, who were saying this is not an issue that any legitimate platform should touch.
That's right.
Mhm.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And it was it was so clear. And so many organizations that I uh, bridging or otherwise um, said the right thing to do here is put out a statement that puts us on one side.
Right.
And we cannot do our job if and I mean, I would have found it difficult to keep working for Braver Angels if we had not taken on that issue.
Mm. Right.
Because like how do you if that's where people's hearts are and if that's what they're uh if that's the thing that is making them feel like they cannot be part of this country,
Mhm.
how are we supposed to not talk about it?
Right.
And
And
so
and yet we were not unified on that point, even within Braver Angels.
absolutely. Yes, I have never gotten so much pressure not to hold a debate. Not
Right.
ever.
Yeah.
We had I had members emailing me, other people on staff, board members threatening to resign. We had funders threatening to pull out, like all kinds of things. And I don't think you'd mind me saying this. Actually, the day before the debate,
Mhm.
uh, my boss called me and said, "I think this may be a mistake. Maybe we shouldn't do this." And I said, "Is that a suggestion or is that an order?" Um,
You put it to
and
him pretty bluntly.
well, and he said, "It's a suggestion."
Right.
And I said, "Well, thank you for the suggestion." And we went through with it. And it was
Right.
so important. It was so important that we did that
Mhm.
because, um, one of my favorite pieces of feedback from that, and we had, people speaking saying, I am confident the election was stolen. Other people saying, um, the claims of voter fraud are what facilitates voter suppression
Right.
and all of that. And we had,
That's an important point to
yeah,
emphasize because that debate was both about the question of, well, voter fraud an issue, but also is voter suppression a
correct.
reality,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing is that those are actually
Mm.
both there. And
Mm.
I sometimes think, and this is a radical thing to say, perhaps, but
Mhm.
I sometimes think that the joke's on us in the sense that um, voter fraud and voter suppression are both big problems,
Mm.
and yet the people who believe in one, we have somehow set up a system where people who believe in one hate the people who believe in the other, and vice
Mhm.
versa,
Right.
and so we can't get anywhere.
Well, yeah, I mean, you did just make a controversial statement because you certainly will have people on both sides who say
Hmm.
that, one of these things is real and therefore one is not like the other. And to both sides, the issue, of course, is
Yes,
is is problematic. Right.
yes, right,
Mhm.
right, and so it was. I was so I had inspired by the people who spoke up on both sides of that
Mhm.
because it included um, speakers in that debate who did not think we should be debating this, who thought it was unethical potentially for us to be debating this at all.
Right.
And you may recall that we actually had to do a podcast where we basically, this was so controversial that we basically had a staff conversation on air, just hashing through why.
Yep.
And talking to people who said we should not do this. Well,
Including
what happens if we don't?
Our good friend, mutual friend, and brilliant thinker and activist Silas Kulkarni.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And who was vociferously opposed to our even doing the debate. Not just that he disagreed with the claim, but that we would even debate it. And yet showed up for that podcast to debate the issue with us on air as a member of Brave Angels leadership team, and then was a part of the debate.
And then showed up at the debate and gave excellent arguments and
debating against the debate itself, which is, the most somehow or other kind of makes him the quintessential Brave Ranger.
Totally.
In some
oh my gosh.
Subsets.
It was so inspiring. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Very much so.
Right.
We were lucky to have him. I mean, not that he's gone, but he's moved on to a different job. Okay. Anyway.
Once a Brave Angel, always a Brave
Angel. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite things about that debate is that at the end of it, you literally saw like him and David Iwinski, who sadly is no longer with us, dancing. David Iwinski being I think the most outspoken, like the election was stolen person.
Right.
And they actually
conservative, Trump supporter, attorney,
so
international businessman.
Yeah.
Our late friend.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And he and Silas became quite good friends as a function of that debate.
That's right.
Right. And I guess the other thing to say about it is that
even before that debate, I think they were very close friends who worked together very closely, I think, within Braver Angels. And of course, we have a number of notable friendships.
Absolutely.
Like that, right?
Yeah. And our Trustworthy Elections initiative comes from that. Some of the outcomes of realizing that voter suppression and voter fraud could be addressed together.
Right.
But more to say about that another time. The thing that I was going to mention is just that I think that if we had not done that debate, we would not have kept our soul.
Right.
In the same way that if we hadn't debated defund the police, we would not have kept our soul as Braver Angels. And that Silas to this day disagrees with me about this. So I, that's the struggle. But I just think that you have to keep talking.
Right.
We have to keep communicating. All the other alternatives are worse.
Okay. Well, let's take that as an opportunity to explore a bit more in sort of our closing minutes here. Your worldview, your philosophical perspectives, because they are multifaceted here, and draw from many sources. And of course, I have the good fortune of sort of knowing you well enough and having had enough sort of interaction with you to sort of have a sense of sort of the tapestry of your perspectives and how they sort of inform the material, the tangible work that you do in this space. But while you have been somebody who's been a public intellectual, really, and somebody who has sort of spoken publicly and interviewed and challenged notable public figures, from former FBI Director James Comey to my friend Heather Hying of intellectual dark web fame, and a good number of others. You've sort of popped in and out of the conversation at various points, and so folks don't always have the opportunity to understand sort of what your cohesive kind of perspective is. So let's start here a little bit sort of with your particular brand of conservatism, right? Because you are a conservative. You discovered your conservatism at Yale, as you recounted for us. You're a conservative at the New York Times, and so for a number of folks, that's an asterisk.
Yep.
Sort of right off the bat, and so forth. And yet yours is a deeply considered conservatism. Can you take a moment to just sort of explain what conservatism means to you?
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you for asking that, because people love to tell me that I'm not really a conservative, except that like I don't think I'm a liberal, and I'm not a leftist, and it's just that it's the only word that actually fits, so far as I can tell.
Right.
And it's because I believe in, and just I feel like it's involuntary, but first of all, I'm very oriented towards the sacred.
Mm.
And I think that mm, I don't know how to understand the world without the terms holy and mundane. And I don't know what it means, what it could mean to honor other people without, like, I need words like honor and sacred and spirit to make sense of the world around me. So that's one thing, is that I to me that is as obvious as the color blue.
Mm.
Um, Another thing is that I really believe that we have a lot to learn from the past, from the wisdom of the past, and from the traditions that are handed down to us.
Right.
And incidentally, I would submit that traditions often they hold productive tensions. And so uh, I have an somewhat dim view of human nature. I think that human beings have a lot of evil in them.
Mm.
They also have good, I think, but I don't. um, as it became clear to me, even clearer when I worked in the intelligence community, the idea that like we can just like let the world like run itself and let everybody else rise and say like, hey, China, Russia, Iran, like you be powerful in your part of the country, the world, and expect everything to be fine.
Mm.
Like that's a fool's game, I
Mm.
think. And so I believe that yeah, human nature has fallen. Uh, we have a lot to learn from the past.
Mm.
Another big thing is that it's much easier to destroy things than it is to build them,
Mm.
particularly the most valuable things, which are organic.
Right.
And so that I do actually mean that literally in the sense of the environment, but also um, cultures and societies and uh, people's understanding of who they are
Mm.
in context of their past. It's much easier to destroy those things than it is to build them. And so I generally get very nervous when people talk about uh, building a brave new world on the ashes of the old one.
Mm.
And this is a thing that divides me from some folks on the right too, because I
Right.
will never be a burn it down person
Mhm.
ever. I think that institutions restrain and refine human nature and help us be better than we otherwise would be. Um, and that they build character, and the character has to be built. It isn't simply something that is. So
Yeah.
that said, I think that we have a lot of assets in the West.
Mm.
And I also think that there's reform that's needed. Note reform, not revolution.
Mm.
And that one of the old traditional lineages that we have forgotten is the parts of tradition and of our history that speak to feminine strength, not
Mm.
just masculine strength.
Right.
Um, Sometimes, go ahead.
Well, okay. So you
Hmm.
just said a key word here, and if we can stretch a little bit, I do want to tie a couple of threads together. So you have talked here about the importance of tradition, of
Hmm.
sanctity. It seems to me that sort of there's some fabric of virtue in your philosophy, and so there are many people in these sort of heterodox. Sort of center in American intellectual and political life, sort of libertarians and many libertarians and many political conservatives who would identify themselves as classical liberals. You hear
Hmm.
that term a lot these days. What you espouse strikes me as something of classical conservatism, and
Correct.
folks who follow me will know that I tend to sympathize with that
Hmm.
philosophical overview as well. And it's not something that you hear given much voice to, outside certain sort of, relatively kind of rarefied spaces in the public conversation. I mean, David Brooks would be an example of someone from that way of thinking. But uh, what is also interesting is you are a feminist.
Hmm.
You are understood as a feminist, and
Hmm.
I have forgive me, I have heard people say, and I could think of an activist or two by name who tweeted out
Uh-huh.
things like, um, "There is no such thing as a conservative feminist.
Right. Right.
This
right,
is
right.
an oxymoron.
Yes. Yes.
Is that an oxymoron?
Absolutely
April?
not.
Okay.
Oh my gosh.
Well, then
No.
why not?
Yeah. No. I mean, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I one of my possible alternative life paths is one where I try to like just prove that wrong,
Right.
because the truth is that in human history there are traditions that articulate feminine strength in a way that is much more powerful than I feel like a lot of people seem to believe that either that the two options are either be the kind of feminist who uh, acquires masculine power but is female,
Okay.
who is somebody who rejects everything about the past and deconstructs it and is powerful in that way, rejects gender altogether, or you have to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. That those are your options, and that is not good enough. And it's also not. It's not. Nobody who actually understands women and understands the nature of women could believe that those are the only options, because there is something so uniquely and powerfully strong in women that that sure, so the Western canon doesn't include it, but that doesn't mean it's not there, and it doesn't mean that it's not a fundamental part of the human experience. And I, like I said, I think tradition needs reform, not revolution. But it's I believe in a uh, uh, fairly traditional understanding of what gender is, in the sense that I believe that there is such a thing as gender. But I think that we need a new expression of feminine strength that can rival masculine strength and yet be the other and different and uniquely powerful thing that it is.
Right. Well, so it's an interesting and unusual sort of combination of labels, right? Conservative, feminists, and so forth. And so it's an indicator of the fact that you may be one of those special folks who finds herself somewhat politically homeless, perhaps, in the conventional sort of way of understanding things. But does that mean that you cannot find empathy with folks let's just put it sort of bluntly here, sort of on the MAGA right or on the BLM left, for instance, the social justice left or sort of the nationalist right? Because what struck me about the space that you hold, in our organization, our community, our larger movement, is that from the unique sort of starting point of your own personal philosophy and experience, you seem to reach all the way down to the bottom of people's hearts in the way that
Thank
you
you.
engage them across that space. And I've seen you win genuine human trust and friendship across that spectrum. What allows you to do that authentically? Are there things that you can sort of feel, I guess, and understand viscerally in what motivates the sort of the concern and discontent of people from way out on those wings?
Very much so. Very much so. So an important thing that is true about me that has for most of my life been an avocation, I never really thought it would be relevant to this work until recently, is that I spent 8 years working on a sexual violence hotline and answering, you know, I've answered thousands of calls and over that time. And I, it just, that and other sort of work, both personal and more theoretical, I've done, mean I have an attunement to trauma and to what that means in people's lives and what it does in them, to their relationships. And I think there's a lot of trauma in our society, and that um, the the people who are the most alienated, and I would consider people on both left and right pretty alienated, and frankly, for pretty good reasons. Like I think they have good reasons to be as angry, disgusted. Ultimately, I think it's the fundamental feeling is betrayed. I think they have good reasons to feel those things, and I know what it's like to be betrayed, as we all do in some form. And but mostly, I hear things to love in their voices, right? Like, and you can hear that the stories that they're telling about their people, their identity, who they are, and what they feel are ways of interacting with pain, often pain and hope, aspiration, and also saying, I have dignity and I deserved better than this. And I just think that that actually, as strange as this sounds, we have a lot to learn from people who have gone through trauma and from those traumatic experiences, and that if we don't go into those, we will never be able to really come back together. And so I have a heart for passionate people and for people who have been hurt. I think they're often the same people. I couldn't make it myself through some days if I didn't believe that there were people out there who would never give up on me. And I feel the same about those people.
So then, April, how does recognizing the sort of lived experience, so to speak, of these traumas,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a very key word here.
Mm-hmm.
How does trauma therefore interact with your particular understanding of truth and reconciliation, or what truth and reconciliation ought to mean?
Thank you for asking.
You're welcome.
When I say truth and reconciliation, a lot of the truths that I think get overlooked are overlooked because they're really hard. The human mind, part of what happens in the mind, in the brain when trauma occurs, is that the brain, because the traumatic memories don't get encoded properly, will sort of oscillate between suppressing any recognition that an event has happened and having that intrude aggressively. This is from the first chapter of my favorite book on trauma, which is by Judith Herman. It's called Trauma and Recovery. And the same thing happens in society, which is to say we pretend things haven't happened, and then there are these outbursts of violent assertion that they have, but there's no container. There's nowhere for those assertions, that pain, to go. And what it tends to do is lead to backlash on the part of the people who feel accused, and then no one gets anywhere. And the other thing that's true is that most major groups in America have stories that are based on traumas that they have experienced as a group. And those stories are often constructed in such a way that they can't, it's very hard to live together. And so I think that, but the good news in all of this is that people can heal from almost anything, from like amazing things. And so if we can, I believe that if we can, that there are ways for us to reconcile. I mean, trauma healing is fundamentally about reconciling inside yourself in some ways, and with the community, with, it's in some ways about healing relationship. It's about other things too, but I think if we can do that inside ourselves, we can do it between one another too. So,
and that American can do so.
Absolutely. And so I think that we've got to have the courage to face those truths, and and also the courage to try to reconcile, right? It's courage, and it's grace, and it's faith is another thing. You've got to have faith that there is a light at the end of all of this, that there is hope, because there is.
Indeed. April Lawson, you are your mother's daughter.
No higher compliment. Thank you.
Thank you for uniting America.
Thank you for listening to Uniting America. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform, and leaving us a positive rating, review, or suggestions. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and tune in for more content. And learn more about the movement to depolarize America at braverangels.org.